Good evening. We need a motion to approve the minutes of the regular Board of Education meeting of 9/9/25. Okay. Kathy, Steve, all those in favor? All right. Good. Dr. Farrelly, take it away.
All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. During our prior Board of Education meeting, we discussed taking a look at the cost to replace all of our current hallway ceiling tiles, right, and the lighting throughout our school buildings. I shared with the board kind of the first step of that. Mr. Algidis put together the estimate for the junior high school. He's going to work on with our architects the rest of the buildings, and once we have that, the board will have that, and then we'll bring it to a board meeting, right, and we'll discuss, the overall, right, cost associated with the labor, the materials associated with that project. Next, in terms of an update, as the board knows, I've been participating in Western Suffolk's ongoing regional planning meetings. District leaders have met several times throughout the last few months. Mr. Payne joined me for one of those meetings. Mr. Maddie joined me for the transportation meetings. We've had in total about 5 or 6 meetings in the last couple of months. We've engaged in collaborative discussions to identify areas where shared work amongst our districts could improve efficiency, expand opportunities, and address some common challenges. 3 main activities that ultimately emerged throughout those meetings that, again, focused on kind of common district needs were as follows, right? Transportation coordination. That's an area that we've already been working with some of our colleagues, some of our, other school districts. So transportation directors, after that initial meeting with superintendents, they followed up and had additional meetings to explore ways to streamline our services and reduce costs within our region for transportation. So building on that work, the specific plan, right, talks about continuing that discussion, reviewing and studying coordinated bus routes, satellite possible pickup and drop-off points, particularly for specialized programs, and specifically McKinney-Vento students. So that would be an aspect that we have not done yet, right, but it certainly would be a benefit to our school district and others as well. Coordinated regional planning in that area obviously has the potential to reduce travel time for students, achieve some cost savings for school districts, and increase equitable access across school districts. Another area that we've identified as part of these meetings is access to advanced coursework. It was actually a consistent theme throughout school districts, and obviously we've talked about declining enrollment, and we know that that's not unique to our school district, right? That is common in other school districts as well. So as a result of declining enrollment, there are some courses that remain not offered, right, in various different districts, despite there being some student interest. So to address this, right, we talked about establishing a regional survey of all of our course enrollment patterns and also our school bell schedules at the high school. And ultimately, once we receive that data, then that'll inform us in terms of, are there opportunities for us to talk to all the different unions, right? Are there, is there an opportunity there to be able to offer, a shared course, right? In terms of for students that we are unable to meet internally within our district. Again, this is really preliminary, right? Just gathering the information from various school districts. Another area was elementary guidance services. If you recall, a number of years ago, there were new state requirements for school districts, specifically having to do with guidance services for our elementary students. So we identified some gaps in elementary guidance counseling, particularly, again, in meeting some of those mandates. As such, we talked about assessing those needs, right, reaching out to guidance directors. If you recall, we don't have a guidance director now, right, anymore, but there are some services that are required by the state, and we're meeting them, we're just meeting them, right? Where maybe other districts have additional resources to be able to provide a little bit more. So we talked about reaching out to those guidance directors, and in our case, some of our guidance counselors, to define what are some priorities, what are some needs that we currently that we need to fulfill, and maybe explore a shared service model, right? Like BOCES does, right, across other areas, where we can be able to, school districts that don't have certain services still receive those services for our elementary students. Another area that we talked about is we know that not just as a region, really this is a statewide, there's a growing enrollment in terms of our students, English language learners and students with disabilities. So ultimately we talked about what areas can we ask for some legislative changes, right? For some additional supports, right? We were mentioning beforehand, students, being certain requirements in terms of the age of 22, right? The reimbursement rates, right? Things on those lines that could help school districts from a financial perspective. Let's see, what other areas did we talk about? Legislative changes, I mentioned those already. Flexibility in the use of UPK funds, right? As we know, we started UPK a number of years ago. Once we started to receive funds, school districts, like many school districts, still leave money behind, let's say, in that line because there are such huge restrictions in terms of its use. So we are, as a collective group, asking for some flexibility there. When we talk about maybe flexibility could allow us to, join with other school districts, right? And again, get more students in those UPK seats paid for, through these funds. So our regionalization implementation action plan, again, which will be submitted to the state, and it's basically a live document. It just continues and continues as these conversations evolve. We'll focus on these specific areas that I outlined there, the course enrollments, the elementary guidance supports, right, as the second other main piece there, and of course in terms of the transportation. So are there any overall concerns, questions with regards to these topics? I think it's important for everyone to, know that this is all continuing to meet, continuing to gather data, continuing to explore, right, these particular areas to ultimately increase efficiencies for school districts and equity. Reduce barriers, again, transportation. Those are the main areas that we identified. If at any point in the process we want to go, no, we're good, we don't really want to continue to, bless you, share our transportation supports, we stop, right? So there's nothing that obligates us to do or not do, right, any of these areas. This is really continuing those discussions, and where there is that opportunity to do so, really taking advantage of that, right? And again, those are the specific areas that we've identified as a region throughout these meetings.
So that's essentially a brainstorming list of ideas, and then each district's going to submit the information needed to see if it's...
So actually, it's a brainstorm of ideas, yes,
But then
but
it has to be
BOCES
submitted.
are regional area,
Right.
exactly. So through,
So
they're
that
going
was
to
submitted
submit.
already?
No.
No.
Nope.
So and this is just a list right now. Then you're submitting all the data from each district, then that goes into the plan?
They are going to submit our regional plan, and our regional plan consists of what I just described, those main categories, and the action items that would include, if we're okay with that, right, as a board, as a team, are the areas that I talked about. Gathering data from the high schools on the course enrollments that we would, that we do have an interest, but I only have 6 students that are interested in this course. Do you have that next door, Babylon? Do you, right? So gathering the data is year 1, right, of these transportation.
But that's all going to happen before the plan's submitted.
No. The first year plan, because the plan is a 10-year, every year you're revisiting and saying kind of where you're at, right?
Okay.
So this first initial submission of the plan is saying what I just outlined out, that we are meeting, that we've had these meetings, that of all these meetings, this is where we narrowed the focus to, these 3 main categories, right? And these are the actions we're going to take there in transportation, the ones that I described, high school enrollment of the courses, what I described there, and guidance, elementary support services, those, and UPK, right? So the plan is going to be submitted by BOCES on our behalf, our regional plan within our piece, to say this is our year 1 plan, and then 8 months later, they have to submit on behalf of our region, where are we at, are we changing, are we doing it, oh, West Babylon is no longer part of the conversation, oh, Half Hills is now part of the conversation, right? Like, they have to kind of consistently every year submit any of those changes. But I don't submit it, so they submit it on behalf of the region. For all of us.
Gotcha.
Questions? Concerns? Continuing the process? Yeah, there's no downside. There really isn't, right? Certainly from a cost perspective, absolutely. Okay, all right, so we will continue there. That is all I had for this section of the agenda.
Actually, a question to that.
Yes.
On the legislative initiative where speak about when the districts are going to talk in reference to legislative priorities and things that they want to change. I'm assuming you mean like elected representatives. That the board would be included in that prior to that being done?
So
Which would be
this
beneficial
was
to the cause?
so two things. The legislative priorities that we talk about, the School Boards Association,
Right.
Superintendent Association, right? BOCES, all those. Those will all be. This is, I'll call it separate, but in reality the same, because this was specifically to the UPK piece, right? Of
Right.
flexible spending on that. That's likely going to be in all the other ones.
Oh, yeah.
In terms
Right.
of as well. This was. By us saying that we're continuing and that we agree in terms of with these, we're saying we as a board, not right, like agree with in terms of these steps, and we also agree with there being some flexibility there in what our elected officials do.
Okay, I
right,
thought you
with
meant
regards to that.
I thought you meant petitioning representatives for
No.
other initiatives. Okay.
Yes, no.
Misunderstood.
That'll come with all the actions that are coming that we'll be
I gotcha.
meeting right together with our elected
Okay.
officials. Yes.
All right, good.
Okay.
We are going to Ms. Goebel, you're up.
Good evening, everybody. I'm going to start off with saying that district-wide, many students are excited for the homecoming game on Saturday. The high school students are very eager for the pep rally on Friday. That's always a fun one. And the dance also Saturday night. Students K-12 in this first month of school have been able to find their routine, getting to know their teachers and their new schools at the beginning of this school year. I would like to note that following this report, I am going to begin reporting on students from individual schools at each meeting. So, for example, at one meeting, I'll do students from Forest, their point of views, and the junior high and the high school at different meetings. And I will be meeting with the students from each school prior to the meeting, talking to them, getting their opinions, and then speaking on what they'd like to say.
Perfect.
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
So, I know it's only been a month, but how would you find the electronic band coming along?
I actually do feel like it has been a huge benefit to, at least in the high school. I know that the junior high and elementary schools definitely didn't have as large of an issue per se with the cell phones, but even in lunch we have a blast. I was playing Battleship today. We play air hockey and foosball, and we were playing Monopoly for 2 weeks, writing down our properties, and it's a lot of fun. I mean, some people are not the happiest about it, but it has kind of forced a lot of people to, I always
Engage.
talk, but a lot of people, that don't always talk, that maybe would have just sat there watching their TV show on their phone. I would say it definitely has made a huge difference, especially in lunch, in socialization, and even in paying attention in class, for sure.
It sounds like the interaction that a whole generation of kids missed in kindergarten, right? Because of all the testing and all the other stuff. Yeah. Okay, you're up. Dr.
Okay.
Farrelly.
So, we have Mr. Mike Leone, partner from Cullen and Danowski, who is here with our financial statements. The board received all the information, I think it was on Friday, right, evening over the weekend. So, Mr. Leone, take it away. And I
Thank you.
shared with the board, I kind of did a little prelude, right, to
Okay,
the
good.
presentation
Good.
during our prior board meeting and highlighted some of the areas that we had talked about.
That's perfect. First thing, I want to invite to the air hockey. I love air hockey.
Yeah.
All right, and I'm really good at it. So just giving you a warning there, all right? It's always a pleasure to be here. So tonight, you received a packet. Included within the packet are 4 documents. There's going to be a test later, so remember. The financial statements, it's a 73-page document. Then we have the management letter. Then our required communications that we have to communicate with you annually. And then there's also the extra classroom financial statements. In addition to that, I handed out a supplementary document. And what I'm going to do is that kind of summarizes some key performance indicators and some key results with respect to the financial statements this year. And I think it's really important. It goes over kind of reserves, and other areas. So I'm going to cover that and kind of refer to most of that rather than go through 70 pages of a financial statement and bore you. So with that said, I am going to start with the financial statements.
Yes, please.
All right, so what I want you to do is just turn to the table of contents. I just want to let you know what's included within the document. Then we're going to go over the opinion, and then I'm going to flip through the supplementary information and kind of walk you through some important information with respect to the results. So if you look at the table of contents, it starts with the independent auditor's report. That's where we issue our opinion. I'm going to go over that shortly. Then there's some required supplementary information, the MD&A. That's extensive information comparatively on the financial statements that talks about this year and the prior year. Again, within my document that the additional document that I gave you, I'll go through that. Then there's the base financial statements with the notes to the financial statements. Then there's some additional required supplementary information that GASB requires. There is a little change in the presentation this year. We presented certain funds in a non-major aspect, and that's because they met certain criteria, and for audit efficiency purposes, we're able to put certain funds into a non-major category. The information is very similar to the prior year, just presented in a different section of the financial statements. There's some supplementary information that's required by the New York State Education Department. And then, of course, there's the government auditing standards in which we have to indicate whether you comply with laws and regulations. And I'm happy to report that there were no findings on that. So with that, we're going to flip to the opinion. So we've issued what is known as an unmodified opinion. There is a qualified opinion on the extra classroom activity funds, as we've discussed in the past. That relates to the cash receipts and the fundraising. There was a change in accounting principle this year. If you recall, when I presented the planning meeting, GASB 101, the compensated absences, briefly on that, that required districts to calculate what a projected liability is for the compensated absences, including usage time of existing time that they've earned. In the past, that GASB 16 just required that you pick up a liability based on the bargaining unit contract. Now this has been expanded a little bit. This resulted in a restatement just on the government-wide financial statements with the long-term liabilities of about a $900,000 increase in that liability. Keep in mind that the financial statements are the responsibility of management. We as the auditors have to perform our work, perform our risk assessments, and then give an opinion on the financial statements. The rest of the information within the opinion I've kind of spoken about has to do with required supplementary information, some additional supplementary information on the non-major funds, the New York State Education, and of course the government auditing standards. With that said, rather than go through this very lengthy document, what I decided to do is put together this supplementary information. It's about 9 pages long, but I'll kind of cover the more important aspects of it. So I've also referred to in this document that the various different pages within the financial statement where the information is located. So one of the most important things that we look at as external auditors is at the end of the year, what do the reserves look like, right? That's important. So the first table here, which is on page 14 and page 22 of the balance sheet, is we look at what the opening reserves were, how you utilize the reserves during the year. Keep in mind that the district does appropriate reserves during the year, and they get to utilize them up to the expenditures in the budget. Then there's interest that's allocated, and then if they have a surplus at the end of the year, which fortunately for the district, based on all the cost-cutting measures that they took, they were able to generate a surplus for the current year, then they can fund certain reserves. You can see one of the major reserves that they were able to fund is that proposition that you had years ago with the capital reserve that enabled you to put about $4 million based on operating surplus results, which is a good thing, right? So now you can make those improvements to the district at no additional cost to the taxpayers. Right below that table is some funding analysis on the reserve balances. One of the important things to think about when it comes to reserves is, what is my balance? How does that compare to my annual expenditures or my related liabilities for these reserves? So we like to lay that out here and show you. So for workers' comp, you had $2,896,770 left in the reserve. You have an annual expenditure of about $695,000, so that's about 4 years' worth of workers' comp expense, right? But it's not just the expense that you look at, it's also what is the potential liability, and the liability that's within the long-term liabilities is $1.4 million, so you have 200% of that, so it's about 2 years. Again, one of the important things is when you look at reserves, the comptroller can always come in and take a look at these reserves and have some points to make on that. You at least want to have at least 100% of that liability. You have more than that. So I think that's fine, but again, I can't, I don't know what the comptroller would come in and say. Looking at unemployment, it's a very small reserve that you have out there. It's $122,000. You had annual expense of $20,000. That's not significant to me. You do have a lot of that reserve. You do have the ability at year end, within 60 days of year end, to move that into another reserve. Legally, you can do that. But with that such a small balance, I don't see any reason for that right now. You also have your TRS reserve and your ERS reserve, right? TRS is the teacher's retirement. ERS is the employee retirement system. TRS has been relatively new for the last couple of years. You're only allowed to put in 2% of last year's salaries for the teachers, right? So that hasn't grown significantly. You have about 34% of that reserve. Each year you can build that up, but you can't have more than 10% in total of that reserve of the salaries. Retirement contribution, you have $3.3 million. Your annual expenditure is $1.9. Another basis for that is you have about 177%. That's a little under 2 years. We look for 2 to 3 years of that. That's good because one of the important things about the ERS as well as the TRS is that these are mandated contributions that you have to make. You can't control them, so it's always nice to have a little bit of a reserve. I added something this year. I just wanted to give you a history of the reserves so you can see how they've trended over the last number of years, right? That's the next schedule down there. So I showed you from June 2022 to June 2025. You can see you were trending down in those reserves from 22 to 23 to 24. And thankfully, you were able to generate a surplus this year and restore some of those reserves. You ended the year with unassigned fund balance at 2025 of 4%. You could see the trend there of what your unassigned fund balance is. That's the maximum you're allowed to keep. Last year you were a little bit below that, but that's what's required by law. You should have more than 4%. And right on the bottom, plan usage of reserve. What I think is really important about this is the district every year budgets and appropriates certain reserves to utilize. And that's really important. That means that the reserves that you're generating, you're using for your expenditures. So you can see each year you're appropriating certain reserves. That's a good thing. I find that as a positive, right? So you utilize that reserve. If you end the year with a surplus, you're able to refund those reserves. Okay, any questions on the reserves? The next page is the unassigned fund balance, just to kind of show you how you came to the 4%. You start with your opening unassigned fund balance. There's some budget revisions. Then there's some schedules that we're going to go over: revenues over budget and expenditures and other financing uses and encumbrances under budget. These are important just from a percentage standpoint. I'm going to go over them with you shortly. The unused appropriated reserves, as I mentioned earlier, if you would appropriate a reserve and you have less expenditure than what you appropriated, you have to put that back into the reserve. So that happened with your workers' comp and your unemployment. Your expenses were not as large as what you appropriated, so you put them right back into the reserves. And then whatever you appropriate for the next year, leaving you at that 4% of next year's budget, which is very good. Now, the next two pages are what I just referred to as your revenues and your expenditures. This kind of shows you whether you're over budget, under budget. So with respect to revenues, your actual revenues exceeded your budget, right? So it was about $3.4 million over that. Right, so that's your budgeting process. Unfortunately, we can't opine upon your budgeting process, but that's a positive thing when you have more revenues than you budget, right? Even considering the fact that you're also appropriating certain reserves, because that is a portion of money or a pot of money that you plan on using to fund your expenditures. So that's a good thing, and this kind of shows you where those various variances are: state sources, revenue, some miscellaneous. And in the case of miscellaneous, you did have some additional revenues for BOCES refunds. So some of these things are unanticipated, and you get them in the actual expenditures. But more importantly, the next page is the one that I think you really need to focus on, because this is your budget, your expenditure-based budget, and how does that compare to actual? So what's important here is, right, it starts out with your original budget, your final budget, then it compares it to what your actual expenditures were, what the encumbrances are, your obligations are at year end, and what is that variance after that. So at the bottom here, you can see that you underexpended your budget by $6.3 million compared to a $137 million budget. That's a 4.67% underspending. Now, typically, if you're in a 3 to 5% range, that's very reasonable, because what's important is budgeting's not an exact science. There are things that you need to build into your budget. There are things that you can anticipate, special education costs, some of the health insurance, mid-year increases or whatever they are, or decreases for that matter. All of those things. So if you're in that 3 to 5% range, that's very healthy. Once you start exceeding that, the OSC could question that your budget might be a little bit inflated, but this is reasonable. Okay, any questions so far?
Just in reference to the term surplus,
Yes.
it's only a surplus until you have to make your next budget, correct?
Well,
I
it's
mean,
well,
does-
here's the way the
because it could
surplus
come off
works.
wrong, that's
Surplus
all.
is really generated on your actual results. So if your revenues exceed your expenditures, right, you have a surplus. That means you receive more fund balance. Now you have the ability to put it into the reserves. But absolutely, next year's budget, if your expenses are continually going up, right, that surplus may have to be used in the form of reserves or an unassigned fund balance if you have unanticipated expenditures.
Right, okay.
So it's a good question, though.
Just wanted
Yep.
to add that little note there.
Absolutely, yeah, that's important, right? So the next few items within this presentation are just showing you what happened with the general fund and the various other funds. I focus most of my time on the general fund because that's the most important fund, right? Because that's what you budget for, right? But there are other funds. So this kind of shows you comparatively what your revenues were, what your expenditures were, whether there was an increase or a decrease, and then there's other financing sources. So kind of let's walk through 2025 compared to 2024. So if you look at the top portion, the revenues were $133.5 million compared to $128.9. That's a $4.6 million increase, or 3.5%. Right, the big drivers there, again, you had a 2.01% tax levy increase, so that generated $2 million in real property taxes and STAR combined. Your state sources, you had, that's based on, your various funding that you get, and once you get the approval of that, you had $2.3 million. Those two primarily make up your differences. There was some additional amount in the miscellaneous there for $334,000 your variance, and as I mentioned, you received an additional BOCES refund, which happens every year. It all depends on what the ending results are with respect to BOCES. Now, on the expenditure side, this is where you were able to do a very good job because you had a lot of cost cutting that was going on. So if you look at your expenditures, you had $130 million compared to $127.8, so a $2.2 million increase, only 1.78%. Now, the big driver here, as you can see in this general support, you had some significant settlements, as you know, for claims and judgments that relate to certain claims. So that was the main driver there. There was over $3 million of settlements that were made there. Other ones are not significant to mention. Your debt has been declining a little bit, so your principal is down with respect to that. And the only thing I really want to go over is really the other financing sources. One of the things that you had the ability to do this year is you utilize bands for those settlements. The ability that you were able to finance them over a longer term gave you the ability to recognize them as proceeds under GASB 62. So typically, bands are just short-term liabilities. However, if you're able to coordinate the maturity dates on that and have that out long-term until you go with permanent financing with a bond, you're able to recognize that. So that was, we had worked with management on that to make sure that they coordinated that, so that $2.5 million is there. There was an operating transfer out of $845,000. Part of those bands that are being redeemed it was agreed upon in the original arrangement that the general fund would fund that, so that was a transfer out to the capital project funds to fund that ban. And then you have your normal operating transfers, which are among your other funds, right? So at the end of the day, you had $5 million increase in your general fund balance, which gave you the ability to fund some of those reserves.
On that same page.
Sure.
What is covered under use of money and property?
So use of money and property is if you have any rentals or your interest that you earn. So again, interest depends on what your interest rates are, how much cash you have in your accounts. So that's what use of money and property is. And at many times, the district might rent out facilities, and they can get payments for that, so that would be included within there.
Okay, and then I guess the same question for other tax items and miscellaneous.
So other tax items, these are good questions, and I appreciate them. Other tax items includes two items. It includes your STAR, which is which I've always said, why don't we just include that in real property taxes? But the New York State Education Department has them in certain categories. So other tax items and your pilots that you get.
Okay.
So Yeah, so those.
And then miscellaneous?
And miscellaneous could be, that's going to be premiums that you get on your bands, that's going to be BOCES refunds, that's going to be any other additional items that you didn't anticipate that don't fall into these major categories. So that fluctuates year to year. All right, you can get workers' comp refunds. Well, more, I shouldn't say that. Workers' comp refunds would fall in the sale of property and compensation of others, and sometimes you get these settlements on those, and those are included there. But good questions. So the remaining pages kind of go through the rest of the funds, right? So the next one is the special aid fund. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. That's really your grants, so your revenues equal your expenditures, less what you need to fund for the summer program by the general fund, so that just zeroes out. You have no fund balance there. The only difference here that you could see is when you look at 25 to 24, you'll see that the revenues and the expenditures were down considerably, and that's because in the past you received American Recovery Funds and COVID-related funds that have ended. So they're no longer there, no longer available. Page 7 is your school food services fund. Again, that's what you manage your school food service fund with, right? So it reflects what your revenues are. You can see that your state sources and your federal sources were up considerably. Again, your community eligibility program, plus the increase in the rates drives that up based on the number of meals served. So that's generating that. Your expenditures were down, believe it or not, just a little bit. And that is because last year you invested a lot in equipment. This year you didn't have that, so that wasn't a repeat, so your expenditures went down a little bit in the school food service fund. Capital projects, that's another big major fund, right? So, again, the things to keep in mind with the capital projects, the district entered into an EPC agreement this year, so that's $9 million, right? So there was a lot of expenditures that related to that, as well as your high school roof project. So just that alone covers over $10 million worth of costs, and then you have various other projects that you're included, and those are the expenditures there. On the bottom, the other financing source talks about where you're getting your funding. So you got $9.9 million borrowings from the EPC. There's some BOCES leases and and I think a truck purchase that you got with an installment debt. Those are all parts of your proceeds. As I mentioned earlier, that $845 is the money that came in from the general fund to help pay for the band. That's a redemption from the general fund. That's treated as a transfer. And then your small operating transfers in and operating transfers out. In the prior year, you had $76,000 left over from your performing arts capital project. You transferred that back, and then you're using that for a newer project in 24-25 for 76. So it was in and out. And then the only one is the debt service, and that's pretty clear. Basically, that's interest earned, and then whatever you're using from the debt service to pay for debt-related expenditures, you transferred into the general fund since you're making the payments there. All right, with that, that kind of covers the financial statements. Again, I tried to do this using this supplementary information because I think this covers the more important aspects of the financial statements than trying to have you flip through a bunch of pages on the financial
This is
statement.
definitely much more helpful, right? Like having
Yeah,
it.
yeah, it gives you a bit, and
definitely.
I think it gives you the big picture. You're on, well, you got
Yes.
some key performance indicators with respect to reserves. You understand where your fund balance is. You understand how you did on your general fund, why you generated a surplus, and how you were able to fund some of those reserves. Okay, so with that, that covers the financial statements. Unless there's any further questions, I'm going to go to the management letter, which is the next item. All right, so the management letter, one of the things that we do is, as part of our opinion, we indicate clearly that we are not engaged to test internal controls. However, as part of our audit engagement, we will look at internal controls, gain an understanding of them, and occasionally we come up with some recommendations where we feel that you can strengthen and improve your operations. So one of the things that you do have is in extra classroom activities. It's a lot of work. There's a lot of advisors. You know, we test the sample of transactions, and 2 items kicked out at us with respect to cash receipts and some cash disbursements. Again, we look at the high school and the middle school when it comes to the extra classrooms. So in 1 out of 10 samples, we noticed that the faculty advisor didn't approve it. There's requirements set forth by the state.
It's in there.
It's only 1 out of 10, but the point being is that we didn't have the finding because we don't test all of the transactions, so we reported that. On the disbursement side, we also noticed in the blue and gold club that there was 1 transaction that was really a taxable purchase for like painting and supplies. And, you know, that's the whole point of that student activity club is to assist the students in managing business, right? So if there's something that's taxable, you have to make sure that you're making the appropriate taxes. Another item that came up, but management was very aggressive in fixing this. There was a little bit of a slip up when it came to the payroll processing. At year end, I think the prior payroll before year-end payroll is a very large payroll for the payout. And what happens is they generate a certain cover sheet to provide for transfers within the payroll. Unfortunately, when the last payroll was processed, that cover sheet for the previous payroll was also submitted on, and some transfers were made. Luckily, the district caught this. But again, there was a lapse in control, so again, we think it's important just to report that, but emphasize the fact that the district was able to correct that. But we want to make sure that the controls are set up so that you can prevent something like that in the future. And I believe Victoria and Lexi have already had the discussion as to what they're going to do to double check to make sure that that cover sheet that is sent over for payroll is checked and double checked so that we don't have a situation like that again. But it was corrected, so that's the more important thing.
Just in reference to that situation, so
Yeah.
you guys noticed that because of the reconciliation?
Yeah, so the bank reconciliations, what we noticed is we noted some large reconciling items. So we had inquired about what those reconciling items were, and sure enough, very transparent, open.
Right.
And they shared with us that was a situation that occurred. And again, it was done, they had to fix it. So when we notice something like that, that's something that, if there's a slip up in internal control, we feel that we should report that. But again, emphasizing the fact that it was captured secondarily, but what we want to do is we want to make sure that's captured before that happens.
Was the secondary capture, though, because there was a process in place to double-check
Yes,
that process?
absolutely.
Or was it?
Absolutely. I think, when, upon doing the reconciliations, that was captured. But what ideally, you want to capture that beforehand.
Okay.
And again, when I've talked about internal controls before, again, when you think about them, there's preventative controls and detective controls. This is evidence of a detective control when you're doing the reconciliation, you spotted it. That's why they're so important. Preventative controls can be something where it could never happen, like you have a user right or a permission that you block somebody out, so that could never happen.
Right.
In a situation like this, for checks and balances, you want to make sure that you have adequate controls in place where you have these detection tools in place, and this is something that came up, so. And then the last item just has to do with capital assets. What's important here, and it's only really from the long-term perspective, one of the things that you're required to do is you're supposed to track your capital assets. So you keep in mind your capital projects fund generates a lot of costs that go towards capital assets. What you should do at year end is when you provide this information to your third-party asset management firm, you should evaluate what was processed in capital projects, and anything that's placed in service should be moved from construction in progress over to the related category within the fixed assets. So whether it's building, whether it's improvements. We noted that you have about $13 million in construction in progress. That's a little high, given that you've done a lot of work in the EPC. Probably a lot of that stuff is already placed in service. So it's just a recommendation in the future just to take a close look at that and provide that information to the third-party management firm so that you're appropriately capturing and reducing the construction in progress, because when something's placed in service, it gets depreciated from a long-term perspective. So that's it. I mean, these are not unusual comments, but I think they're well received, and I think they're just, what's important here is just to make sure that we point out some internal controls that we came across and just looking for improvements on that. Any questions on a management letter? Okay, our required communication is very simple. That is going through all this information with you, letting you know that we didn't encounter any major problems, we didn't have to consult with any other accountants. All the estimates and information contained in the financial statements is fairly stated. No variations from that. Also points out that we did have the GASB 101 implementation. The last item, and I'm not going to test you to remind you which order they were in, is the Extra Classroom Activity Club. And basically what this shows you is it just kind of lays out the middle school and the high school, and it shows you what their beginning balance was, what they received in the form of receipts, what the disbursements were by club, what the ending balances are. And again, we look at certain transactions and we test them. We also make sure that the opening balance is tied from the previous year. And then we look at the activity to make sure that that is organized and in the appropriate category, and that the ending balances are reported and reflected properly. Again, the most important thing here is to keep in mind that we don't have the ability to opine upon without issuing a qualified opinion with respect to the cash receipts. And we've covered that, and that you find that across all the school districts. The only way to prevent something like that would be to have systems in place to make sure any fundraisers that are captured or done outside of the school grounds, you have very, very tight controls, and you would have to provide that to us. So that's always an option, and then that would get rid of the qualification. But it's an involved process, so that's something just for consideration.
I think one time we were 2 out of 10, so we.
That's still very good.
Yeah.
That really is. If we're only finding that, I hate to say it, but I've had situations where there's pretty egregious findings
Yeah.
with respect to extra classroom, and they're numerous, and they don't seem to correct themselves because, you know what, it's not really centralized, it's decentralized when
Yeah.
you're talking about various different advisors, and it's very difficult, right? They're also doing their regular functions, and now they're participating in this. Even though they receive a stipend, you know, sometimes things fall through the cracks. So
Yeah.
one of the things that's, when we test it, is to report on what we find so that we can find some
Yeah,
sort
it's
of
very
corrective
fast
action.
and loose, that whole operation, because you have many receipts coming in and
Yes.
out, different people running around.
It is. It's not easy to manage. So,
Yeah.
I mean, listen, we're not in the business of being overly critical. We just want to point out some areas that we think you can strengthen in internal controls and
I had one
just
other-
improve upon.
One
Yeah.
other question on the
Sure.
journal entry letter you sent us.
Yeah.
I guess it was a AU-C260, whatever.
Yeah,
that
yeah,
means.
that's
That's how I call
That's the
it.
audit standard.
Yeah,
That's right. Good for you.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Under the qualitative aspects of accounting practices, there's a line in there, and I read the paragraph 50 times.
Yeah.
I'm trying to understand the perspective of why it's in there. It says no other accounting policies were adopted, and the existing policies was not changed during the year. What is that?
Okay, so that means from a financial statement standpoint, no policies that would impact the financial statements were in here. That would, we do mention within here that there was the GASB 101 implementation, which did impact the financials. Now, you could have policies and procedures in place for other things
Okay.
within the district, but that has nothing to do with impacting the financial statements. So
Okay.
that's very specific to that, but that's a very good question.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, because it doesn't mean that you haven't adopted any policies during the year. Of course you have, right?
Right. Right.
Managing a school district's enormous, right?
Right.
So
Yeah,
there's
I
tons
wasn't-
of policies.
I wasn't sure if you were interpreting that as a recommendation that was previously made, meaning
Yeah.
no, that we did not react to
No,
recommendations.
no,
Okay,
no,
great.
no, not at all, but good question. All right, if there's no further questions, then I think the only thing that we need is the representation letters return. Look at this.
We're ready.
And then we're able to go final on this, and we can submit that to the state.
Yes.
All right, perfect. Thank you all very much.
Thank you,
Thank
and
you.
thank you so much for your
Appreciate it.
support and guidance and
Absolutely.
recommendations throughout the
Our
process.
pleasure.
So
Always
appreciate
here.
it. Thank you.
Take care now.
All right.
Talk to you.
Okay, at this point, we're going to kick it over to Mr. Payne, who is going to provide an update on UPK for us.
Okay. No podium. It's good for everyone. So I'm going to give a quick overview of the UPK program and where we've been, where we're going. Obviously, this is our 5th year doing UPK. We've partnered with Scope for all 5 years. It's been a wonderful partnership. They really are a very strong presence in the UPK world, but very good for West Babylon as well. I'm going to start with this and end with it, right? So during our first 2 years, we were capped by funding, right? We had plenty of space and plenty of interest, but we didn't have enough funds. It sort of it did after 2 years, and we had sort of capped by interest, right? We had plenty of space, plenty of funding, but we didn't have enough interest for UPK. So we were capped, sort of limited by that. And then as we all know, right, I'm going to end with this, and I'll talk about it a little later on. Right now, we have a tremendous amount of interest, we have a tremendous amount of funding, but we don't have enough space. So it's interesting to see how it shifted for us throughout the tenure here. UPK in West Babylon. The larger schools, and I think everyone knows this, have always run more sections than our smaller schools of UPK. South Bay has never had room for a UPK section, and Forest was a smaller school that really for a while, only had one section. So UPK is represented differently, as you know, in all the buildings. As I mentioned, space was a limiting factor, so we have 7 sections of UPK this year. We have no outside sections, as I know the board is aware. We have 1 section at Tooker Avenue, 2 at JFK, 3 at Sanapog, for a total of 108 students in our UPK program. At the start of the summer, there were 81 students on our wait list. Currently, there are 88, and we've had 6 openings filled, so we've actually increased our wait list by about 13 to 15 students because we have gotten some into the program as people have left. We have partnered with our SAFE program to provide PM childcare for UPK students at Sanapog, which has been a great experience. Particularly after we had some of the shiftings with some of the outside programs that may have had after-school programs. We were able to do it here. And I think I'm going to end with this piece, right? I talked about space being a limiting factor, as we all know. So one of the things we're looking to do under the auspices of the board and Yendi, Dr. Farrelly, is to look to get more space for our UPK programs, potentially in the form of the junior high school or the senior high school. So we're looking to, this year, to look at both of those buildings. It looks kind of like the high school right now, and we'll talk about why that might be better for us, to get UPK sections housed in the senior high school, maybe the junior high school as well. That would allow some freeing up of rooms in the elementary schools, which we desperately need. It might even allow for more sections of UPK in West Babylon, which would be a great thing. But one of the exciting things that we think we can do is potentially start to run some education or childcare classes at the senior high school, where we could utilize our senior high school students to get actual experience with our own UPK program. So the senior high school as a location would provide a tremendous number of benefits. We're starting to look at it now. It's gonna be an exhaustive process because there's going to have to be some significant facility changes to do that, as well as isolation issues and all of that. But we hope to be able to present to the Board of Ed by December or January the feasibility and cost of this proposal. So that's it. Questions?
Quick question, and
Sure.
to anybody, do we know how they calculate the funding for the UPK? Because it doesn't, there's districts that don't use it, and yet they still got an increase in
Right.
funding for UPK.
Right.
And I don't want to say that I think it's an easy increase for the state to suggest, because then they can say, look at the increase in education,
Right.
and then you don't use it and they get it back. So is there a,
I
We don't really
defer
know.
to my colleagues. I have no idea.
No idea.
okay. 'Cause
So,
we-
like I said in the
we
beginning,
had
we were
increases
limited,
too.
Ms. Palillo, by the funding, and then it opened up tremendously.
Right, okay.
So,
Yeah. And again, there are restrictions, right, on its
Absolutely.
use.
okay, to be continued.
Yeah, great.
Thank you, Mr. Payne.
Thank you. And that's it, right?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, statement of residence. At this time, residents wishing to make a statement on agenda items only, come to the podium, state their name and their address. They can also write the information on an index card and give it to the Assistant Superintendent of Finance and Operations. Comments on individual students or employees are not permitted. Each resident will have up to 3 minutes to speak, with a total of 15 minutes allotted. Responses will be given after all statements. Questions needing further research will be addressed at the next meeting. Okay. Okay, approval of the consent agenda. We need a motion to approve the consent agenda. Patty, Steve, all those in favor? Okay. Great. Policy review. Motion to waive the first time reading and adopt policy 4322 as revised. Steve? Katie? All those in favor?
I'm sorry, you said Katie?
Yeah. They're sleeping over there. I always look. Last time I didn't look over there, I got in trouble. Okay. Old business? Any new business?
Let's do a quick congratulations.
Sure.
I would like to just take a moment. The board has just voted on the consent agenda to congratulate Shannon McCaffrey, who is in our audience, our new SLP. Welcome to the WB family.
What's SLP?
Speech and language pathologist.
Great. Can't reduce that job to just an acronym. It's very important. Okay, statement of residence. Any resident wishing to make a statement on any general topic? please come to the podium, state their name and address. You can also write your name and address information on the index card or present it to the Assistant Superintendent of Finance and Operations. Comments of individual students or employees are not permitted. Each resident will have up to 3 minutes to speak, with a total of 15 minutes allotted. The responses will be given after all statements. Any questions needing further research will be addressed at the next meeting. Nope. Good. Okay. We need a motion to adjourn. Steve, Kathy, all those in favor? That's everyone. All right. Thank you so
Good
much.
night, everyone. Thank you.
Congratulations.